So my goal today is to land the plane on this series and wrap all of this up. Hopefully I can do that and address some of the questions that maybe have been popping around your head. But if it's your first time with us, thanks so much for joining us. If you find this interesting and want to catch up, all of these weeks have built throughout this series. But you can go to our website, our app, our YouTube or Roku channel or Apple TV, all the places. We've got things and you can watch it if you're interested. I'll do 30 seconds of quick catch up for everybody though, or reminders. The point of this series is simply that most of us know stories from the Bible, whether you're a church person or not. Very few of us know the story of how we got the Bible, and I just think that's really important. It's almost as important as what's in the Bible for this reason, because if you don't understand how we got the Bible, you'll misunderstand what's in the Bible. It is so easy to dismiss or to discount some of the stories in the Bible if you don't understand how we got them to begin with. It's really easy, quite honestly, to disengage from the content of the Bible and just say, that's not really relevant to me if you don't understand the story of how we received it to begin with. Now, what's odd, or one of the things that makes understanding the Bible, the story of how we got the Bible, a little weird, is the Bible isn't like any other book that we have. The story of how we got the Bible doesn't begin in the beginning of the Bible. You take any other book, you just start in the beginning, start reading. That's not what you should do with the Bible. The story of the Bible actually begins in the first century, and it begins with all of Jesus' followers who believed he was God in human flesh, watching him down a Roman cross, and then walking away and abandoning him. This is where it all starts. And as Jesus' body lay in a tomb, there were no Christians, there were no Jesus followers, there was nobody going, yep, I believe and I think it's going to be good, and there was nobody saying, we've got to write down these accounts of his life. It's just extraordinary. People are going to want to know. No, nobody was interested in doing that. Because why would you be motivated to share the story of someone who showed up and claimed to be God, and then you watch him die on a Roman cross and his body's in a tomb? End of game, story over. You're not going to share that story. There's no reason to share it. But the story of the Bible begins on that third morning when a group of ladies show up at the tomb, not expecting to find it empty. They show up at the tomb prepared to finish off getting Jesus' body ready for burial. And they find the tomb empty, and their first thought is, somebody stole the body, because that's the most logical, rational explanation for why the tomb's empty. They watched his body be placed in it. Now he's not there. Clearly somebody came and stole the body, and they didn't believe, and Jesus' other followers didn't believe until they saw him alive with their own eyes. And it took, in the end, there were about 500 different people in different occasions over the course of a 40-day period who saw Jesus alive for themselves. And suddenly, something extraordinary had happened that so many people had seen, they could not deny it. It was unbelievable, but it was undeniable. And so that moment, that extraordinary event, sparked a flurry of activity that led to people sitting down and writing the accounts of Jesus' life. And we have 4 independent accounts today, and you're probably familiar with them: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. 2 Jewish men, 2 Greek men. But they all felt the importance of sitting down and documenting what happened in Jesus' life for one simple reason: because he died and rose again. Other than that, there'd be no reason for them to write it. But that event sparked a flurry of activity which led them to document about his life. And then, as we've talked about, this message of Jesus didn't just stay in Jerusalem. It didn't just stay in Israel. It didn't just stay with Jewish people. It began to spread to Gentiles all over the known world. And then the Gentile people began to follow Jesus in large numbers, and they suddenly took an extreme interest in the sacred text of the Jews, the Jewish scriptures, not because they were interested in the Judaism of the Jews, the religion of the Jews, but because they were interested in learning the backstory to what God had been doing that led to Jesus showing up on this earth. And so these Gentile followers of Jesus took the Jewish scriptures, they incorporated them into their Christian worship, they took the 4 accounts of Jesus' life, and they had some correspondence from a few different individuals, but primarily from a famous church planter. And I want to spend the rest of our time today, as we land this plane with this series, talking about this man, because the contribution he made to the story of how we got the Bible is so significant. Now, whether you're a church person, a Christian or not, you've heard of this guy. You have heard or read some of what he wrote, there's no doubt. He's known as the Apostle Paul, but he had another name, which was Saul of Tarsus. Tarsus was where Saul or Paul was originally from. Now let me explain real quickly why we have 2 names. Paul was a Jew, and as a Jew, he had a Hebrew name, and Saul was his Hebrew name. But this was very unique in the first century. Not only was Paul a Hebrew, but Paul was also a Roman citizen. And his Roman name was Paul. So he began as Saul of Tarsus, and his early career was actually being a Pharisee. The Pharisees were the ruling religious power of the day, and we'll talk more about the significance of that in a minute. But Paul began as a Pharisee known as Saul, and yet once he has an extraordinary encounter with Jesus that causes him to begin following him, then Paul goes around the Mediterranean Rim to all of these places in the Roman Empire, these non-Jewish places, and he's sharing the message with Jews, but he's also sharing the message with Gentiles, and so it made more sense for him to go by his Roman name of Paul, and that's how we know him today. And I'm telling you, whether you're a Christian or not, what you believe and what you value, your filter through which you make decisions today, it has been largely impacted by the writings of the Apostle Paul. You may not even believe what he wrote. You may not believe in, what he believed. But I'm telling you, your values and the filter through which you make your decisions, it's been impacted by it. You can talk to academic scholars, Christian or not Christian, and they will almost unanimously agree that the Apostle Paul had as much of an impact on Western civilization as anyone else. And some will say it's more than anyone else. He shaped our values and our beliefs and how we view other human beings and how we view what's proper and improper behavior. He shaped it more than anybody, I would argue, throughout the history of Western civilization. And yet, if Paul were here today and we began to talk to him about the impact he had made, Paul would immediately look at us and say, no, you don't understand. I'm not that big of a deal. And we would say, are you kidding me? Of course you're a big deal. You're Paul, we've got all this stuff and you've impacted all these things. We still read you at our weddings, Paul, like you're a big deal, He'd say, no, I'm not a big deal. And the reason I know he would say that is because he wrote that to a group of people living in the city of Corinth. Let me show you what he said real quick. He said, for I am the least of the apostles. In other words, Paul was saying to them, okay, all the apostles, all the people who were the closest followers of Jesus, Peter and Andrew and James and John, all those guys. Paul says, well, if you're listing them in order of importance, you put me at the bottom of the list. If you're lining us all up, I'm going to the back of the line. I'm the least of all the apostles. Paul, why would you say that? He says, I don't even deserve to be called an apostle. You got to be kidding me, Paul. He said, no, I'm not kidding you. Okay, Paul, why would you feel like after all the contribution you made that you shouldn't even be called an apostle? Is this false humility? No, it's not false humility. Paul had a reason why. Look at what he said. He said, because I persecuted the church of God. Now, this is a fascinating backstory, and I don't have a lot of time to go into it, but we'll spend a Sunday one of these days talking about this story. As I said, Paul grew up with his early career being a Pharisee. And Paul, by his own admission, says, I wasn't just an average Pharisee. I was a Pharisee among Pharisees, which was his way of saying I was one of the best that we had. And the Pharisees were responsible. They were people who lived separate. They were people who followed the old covenant or the old law, what we call the Old Testament. They were people who followed it meticulously. And they were people who protected the ancient tradition and the ancient religion of Judaism. That was their job. Paul grew up, and in his early years, he was one of the top Pharisees of his day. So much so, he believed in this so deeply, that when this movement of Christianity began, Pharisees immediately knew that what Jesus introduced in the world was something brand new that conflicted with the old covenant that they held onto so tightly. And so Paul stepped forward, being the type A personality he was, Paul stepped forward and said, I will personally, if you give me permission, put an end to this forever, because we're not going to let anything threaten Judaism. And so Paul got permission to go around Jerusalem, and he began to arrest, to persecute, to torture, in some cases to imprison or to kill different followers of Jesus who were the key leaders of spreading this message of Christianity. And when Paul thought he'd done a pretty good job in Jerusalem, then he said, will you give me permission to go to some other towns and places where this message is catching fire, and I want to put an end to that there. And his goal was simple. His goal was to crush the church. His goal was to crush the movement. They didn't call it Christianity then, but his goal was to crush it. He didn't intend for the message of Jesus to live beyond the first century. And he was doing a phenomenal job of it. Until on the way to Damascus in Syria, in order to, planning to arrest more Jesus followers, he has this extraordinary encounter with Jesus himself. And he sees the resurrected Jesus, has a conversation with him, and Paul suddenly realizes, oh my goodness, I've been wrong all along. And he does in one afternoon a 180. From I'm going to crush the church to I'm its biggest proponent. And this is just fascinating to me that God chose. It was like he was up in heaven going, okay, all these people in Jerusalem, we told them, Jesus, to take the message to the whole world. They won't leave Jerusalem. So I tell you what, we got to find somebody else to do it. How about we take this guy who's so passionate that he'll go to all the nations to crush the message? How about we just take him and flip him to our side? And that's exactly what God did in a moment, in an afternoon. God chose to take the greatest enemy of the church and turn him into its greatest advocate. And Paul spent the rest of his life traveling around the known world, sharing the message of Jesus. But if you'd sat him down and you'd said, Paul, look at the contribution you would make, Paul would have said to you, no. I'm not that big of a deal. You don't understand what I did to the church. You don't understand I'm the least qualified of anybody to be doing what I'm doing, and yet by the grace of God, he's still using me. Now, the reason I bring that up is simply this. Because it does not matter who you are or what you've done or what you've got going on in your world right now or what's in your past. If there's room in God's family for Paul, there is room in God's family for you. If God has a purpose and a plan for Paul, God still has a purpose and a plan for you. You're never beyond the reach of God's grace. And you're never disqualified from his plan and purpose for your life. So anyway, back to Paul. He begins to travel around. He begins to spread this message. And Paul made at least 3 significant contributions to the story of how we got the Bible. And I just want to take the next few minutes to walk you through them as we wrap up this series. The first contribution was this. Paul wrote some of the Bible. That's pretty obvious. Specifically, though, he wrote 13 different letters. A few of them were to individuals. Most of them were to churches that he had started or that he was trying to help. He wrote 13 different letters, which account for, if you take all the content of the New Testament, it accounts for about 25%, about a fourth of the New Testament. And these writings were pretty extraordinary. Matter of fact, when these churches, when these Christians would get these writings where Paul was explaining the message of Jesus to them, they treated them as so precious. They treated them as if they were valuable and reliable, sacred, and inspired Scripture. They treated them as if they were extraordinarily special. And so these churches, they would read them to their congregations, and then they would meticulously copy them and hand it off to another congregation. In some cases, Paul would not write to one church. He'd write to a whole region, a whole group of churches. For instance, Galatians is a letter Paul wrote, not to a church. Galatia is a region. So he wrote a letter and he said, hey, you churches just pass this around amongst yourselves because you all need to know this information. And they would copy it and pass it and copy it and pass it and copy it and pass it because they valued what Paul wrote so much. The second contribution Paul made is this. Paul explains the relationship between the Jewish Scriptures and what Jesus did. Now, I want to camp out here for a little while because this is extraordinarily important for all of us. As a Pharisee, Paul was an expert in the Old Covenant, or the Old Law, the Law of Moses, the Old Testament as we call it. Paul was an expert in it. As a matter of fact, Paul probably had the entire Old Testament memorized. That's how seriously they took what they did. You couldn't find anybody in the first century who was more of an expert in the Old Covenant than Paul. And yet, when Jesus shows up in his life and he has a 180, Paul does something so valuable for all of us. He begins to explain the relationship between the Old Covenant and this brand new thing that Jesus introduced. And Paul knew it was a brand new thing. The whole reason Paul was fighting against Christians before he became one is because he knew this brand new thing was at odds with the Old Covenant. To him, this brand new thing threatened the Old Covenant and the way of life that the Jews had lived with for centuries. So nobody understood this tension any better than Paul. And yet once he became a Christian, in all of his writings, this is pretty fascinating, in all of his writings, Paul would write and say, let me explain to you about the importance of the resurrection. Let me explain to you about this brand new thing, this brand new covenant Jesus introduced. And then I want to show you how the two go hand in hand. And I want to show you how you should now live in light of what Jesus has done. So the reason I want to camp out here for a few minutes is because if you're one of those people, and I get it, I think this is common for a lot of us. If you're one of those people who's always felt confusion or tension around, okay, well, how's the Old Testament and the New Testament, aligned together? It's like there's one type of atmosphere in the Old Testament and it's totally different in the New. It's like there's one kind of God in the Old Testament and a different one in the New Testament. No. Paul is going to explain that and how they go together for you. So let me explain it this way. I believe if Paul had been able to be present when you were given your first Bible, the way we know the Bible today, if Paul had been there when you were given that book that was all chaptered and versed and mapped and wrapped, Paul would have looked at you, and before you ever opened it up for the first time, he would have said, okay, I want to give you 2 pieces of advice. The first piece of advice he would have given you was this. You should read the Old Testament for information and motivation, but not application. Paul would have looked at you and said, by all means, when you're reading the Old Testament, you read that thing for information because there's some extraordinary information in there. There's extraordinary information about the backstory of how Jesus showed up on this earth. There's extraordinary information about God's plan and purpose for the Jewish people and how he shows up in their lives and in the nation's history and how he moves and proves his love for us. There's extraordinary information in there. Don't miss the information. Paul just said, read it for information. And Paul just said, you ought to read the Old Testament for inspiration. Inspiration about what not to do. Inspiration, you just look at all the things the Jewish people chose to do that ended up getting them in consequences and, facing situations they shouldn't have faced and ended up getting them at odds with God. You should read all of that and use it as warnings. Don't go there. Don't do that. And you should read it as inspiration in a positive way because in the midst of the Jewish people making all of these mistakes and, rebelling against God, God remained faithful to them. God always showed up even when they didn't think he was going to show up. So you should let those things inspire you because when you're in those situations, you can have confidence God's going to be there for you too. Paul would say, by all means, read it for information, read it for inspiration, but don't read the Old Testament for application. Don't figure out how you're going to live your life based on what the Old Testament says. Because Paul believed, and he wrote this in most of his writings, Paul believed that old covenant that told the Jewish people how to live and all the things they should and shouldn't do, Paul believed that Jesus had landed the plane of that old covenant, that he had fulfilled it, and that it was obsolete, that it had served its purpose and it was not necessary anymore because Jesus had introduced a brand new covenant, and we were to figure out how to live based on that, not based on the old covenant. Now, there are a couple reasons I believe Paul would give you this advice. One is you find it in a lot of his writings. Matter of fact, in the letter he wrote to the Corinthians, in 1 Corinthians 10, Paul basically tells them this very thing. He says, you ought to read the Jewish scriptures and take warning of all the times the Jewish people messed up. You ought to pay attention and not repeat the mistakes they made. Read it for information and inspiration, but don't read it for application. There was also an instance where there were Jewish people who were following Jesus in the early days who wanted to take the old covenant way of thinking and drag it back into what the new thing Jesus had introduced. And so as Gentiles were starting to follow Jesus, if you read Acts, which is the history of the early church, you'll find that these Jewish people were coming along to Gentiles saying, no, you can't just follow Jesus. It's not that easy. You got to follow Jesus and you got to fulfill or follow the old covenant. And Paul would show up and go, no, that's not true. This old covenant, it's done. It's served its purpose. It's over. And in Acts 15, you can read it for yourself. There was a debate among the early church leaders about what's true. And Paul made a compelling case that the old covenant, it was through. It was done. Even for Jewish people. And they get to the end of it and they decide, you're right, Paul. We're not going to expect anybody to follow the old covenant anymore. This isn't where we're going to look for application on how to live our lives anymore. There's a brand new way to live. And that leads me to the second piece of advice that I think Paul would give us. You should take your application cue from Jesus' new covenant command for you. Okay, you're trying to figure out what it looks like to follow Jesus and be a great parent. What it looks like to follow Jesus and be a great son or daughter. What it looks like to follow Jesus and have a great marriage, be a great spouse, be a great employee, date well, be a good student, whatever, be a good friend, whatever the area is of your life. Manage your finances well. Paul says if you're trying to figure out how to be a good follower of Jesus and apply what Jesus taught to these areas, don't look at the old covenant. You just focus on Jesus' new covenant command for you. Now, if you've been here a while, you know we've talked about this off and on a lot of times. Jesus' new covenant command was a single command that he gave the night of his arrest. He looked at a group of Jewish men And he said, no longer do you have to worry about the old covenant requirements. Forget the 613 commands. Forget the 10 commandments. There's just one commandment now you're to live by. And here's what he told them. A new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. And by this, everyone will know that you're my disciples if you love one another. Now, we read that and we're like, oh, okay, it's not a big deal. I'm telling you, it was huge for these Jewish young men. Because they had grown up under the old covenant, and the rule in the old covenant was eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. Now, Jesus had looked at them, and Jesus had talked about the golden rule at different points. You should do to others the way you want others to do to you. But on this night, Jesus says, listen, I'm introducing a brand new command. It is the only command you'll ever need from this point on. Andy Stanley loves to call this the platinum rule. Forget the golden rule, the platinum rule. It's that much bigger than everything else. He said, I don't want you to love other people the way you want other people to love you. I want you to love one another the way I have loved you. The standard is way higher. And don't forget that the very next day, Jesus hung on a Roman cross. And they saw with their own eyes exactly what that kind of love looks like. And it took their breath away because Jesus gave his breath away the very next day. So when you read the writings of Paul, he comes back to this one command over and over and over again. And in all of his writings, he'll say, let me tell you about this brand new covenant command that Jesus introduced. And then let's talk about how it applies to you. Now, if you've ever read much of Paul's writings, you may have gotten the impression that Paul was introducing a lot of rules or a lot of laws and commands of his own, because he talks about you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do this, live this way, don't do this. You're like, well, it just sounds like a lot more rules, but that's not what Paul was doing. All Paul was doing in his writings was saying there is one command. We're to love one another. If you follow Jesus, you're to love one another the way Jesus has loved you. Now, let me just show you what that looks like in a lot of different areas. All Paul's doing in his writings is giving a lot of examples of what it looks like to live this out. I'll show you a few examples real quick. So Paul wrote a letter to Christians in Ephesus, and he gives a lot of examples in this letter of what it means to live as a follower of Jesus, loving people the way Jesus has loved us. Here's one of the things he said in Ephesians 5. He said, submit to one another. Now that word submit means to put the interests and desires and needs of somebody else ahead of your own. It means to treat whoever you're with as if they are the most important person in the room. It means to treat whoever you're with as if their needs come before yours. I'm prioritizing you before me, you before me, you before me. That's what submit means. To which, if we had been reading this from Paul, we would have thought, and we do think, well, wait a minute. Not everybody is worth submitting to, Paul. There's some people I'll submit to and they'll take advantage of me. There's some people who just don't deserve, based on how they've lived, for me to submit to them. I can submit to some people because of how good a person they are. I'm not going to put the needs of that person in front of my own because they don't deserve it. To which Paul said, you're not doing it because somebody deserves it. He says you submit to one another out of reverence for Christ, not out of reverence for the other person. You don't do it because they deserve it. You do it because your heavenly Father sent his Son to this earth who chose to submit himself to you when you didn't deserve it. And so if you're a follower of Jesus, and if you're not, you're off the hook. Congratulations. This might be a great day not to be a Christian, because for all of us who are Christians, man, this is a hard standard to live up to. But he's saying, if you're a follower of me, you've experienced what it's like for me to love you and to submit to you, to put your needs and interests before my own. Now, I want you to turn around and do that for everyone that you meet, not because they deserve it, but because I did it for you when you didn't deserve it. One chapter before, Paul gave another example to them. He said this, be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other. To which, again, we have the exact same response. So like, well, okay, well, they're not too hard to forgive, and that's not too hard to forgive them. And I realize they didn't mean to do it, and they, but no way am I forgiving that person. Do you have, we want to raise our hand and tell Paul our story. Do you understand how intentionally and deeply they tried to hurt me? There's no way I'm forgiving them. Do you understand all the things that happened to lead up to this point? There's no way. To which, again, Paul would say, no. Your job as a follower of Jesus, your responsibility is not to be kind and compassionate and forgive the people who are easy to be kind, compassionate, and forgiving towards. You're to do it just as in Christ God forgave you. You want to know what's your motivation for being kind, compassionate, and forgiving? Your motivation is not they deserve it. Your motivation is God forgave you. He was kind and compassionate to you when you did not deserve it yourself. So you extend to others exactly what God has extended to you. You love one another the way I have loved you. In a letter to Christians at Philippi, Paul wrote it this way. He said, in your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus. And you can read it for yourself, but he goes on to explain what that mindset was. He said Jesus showed up with all the power of the universe, and he didn't power up, he powered down. He showed up deserving more than anyone on the planet to be served, and yet he chose not to be served, but to serve and to give his life for others. He took the power that he had and the privilege that he had, and he used it for the benefit of other people, not himself, even though those people sometimes didn't appreciate it or didn't value him in return. So Paul says, all right, if you're following Jesus, there's your standard. You pick any relationship you want to pick. Let's not talk about those. Those are the easy ones. Let's pick the hard relationships you got in your life. Let's pick the relationships with the people that just drive you crazy and they create so much hurt and so much anger and so much frustration. Let's think about them for a minute. Paul would say you should step into those relationships loving and serving those people, not because they deserve it, not because they're going to love and serve you back. You should do it because when you didn't deserve it and when you weren't interested in loving and serving Jesus back, he still did this for you. You can take any of Paul's writings, and this is a theme you find over and over again. You find Paul saying, hey, you ought to be truthful to other people. And if you raised your hand and said, well, Paul, explain to me, why should I be truthful? Why is that such a big deal? Like every now and then it's okay, right? Every now and then you don't have to tell the truth or the whole truth. You know, every now and then you can tell a little white lie. Paul would say, no, you missed it. You missed it. You shouldn't lie, but not because in the Old Covenant there's a commandment that says thou shalt not lie. That is not the reason. Paul would argue you shouldn't lie because when you lie, it's not loving to the person you're lying to. When you lie, you are hurting and disintegrating that relationship because you're destroying trust and integrity. And trust and integrity are the foundation for any great relationship. And when you take somebody's trust, you hurt them deeply. So Paul's argument for not lying was not the 10 Commandments. Well, it's right there in the Big Ten. He never brought that up, not once. He said, you don't lie because you're to love one another the way Jesus has loved you, and lying is not the loving thing to do. Paul talked a lot in some of his letters about sexual behaviors and practices people had. Because in that culture, it was far more promiscuous than it is in our culture. And so he would say, no, you gotta keep your sexual choices in line with God's design. That sex is for married people, not just mature people. To which today we read it and we still go, that's so outdated and antiquated, like, Paul, you don't know what you're talking about. To which Paul would say, no, you're missing it. I'm not trying to control you or control the choices you make. Well, why would I care? Paul says, I'll tell you why I'm telling you that. Because when you step out of line with God's design sexually, you create regret. You create regret, future regret in that person's life that you engaged with, even if they're all for it right now. You create future regret in your own life. You create future regret or regret with your spouse or your future spouse, and you create regret or future regret with their spouse or their future spouse. So Paul says, I'm telling you to manage your sexuality God's way, not because we care what's going on in the bedroom. I'm telling you because when you don't, you are unloving. You're actually creating regret, and nobody should be a part of somebody else's regret story in the future. It is not the loving thing to do. You're damaging their ability to experience future intimacy. And ironically enough, research today has shown that what Paul wrote 2,000 years ago about damaging how sex outside of marriage damages the ability to have future intimacy. Research shows today that is absolutely correct. How in the world did he know? That's a discussion for another day. But it's fascinating. You pick anything. You pick gossip, when Paul talked about gossip, cheating, stealing, you name it. Paul was never just given a rule and saying, you ought to do it because it's in the list of rules. You've not read the rules, you need to read the rules. No, Paul would say you don't do that because it's not the loving thing to do. You should do what love requires of you. You should love, if you're a Christian, you should love one another the way Jesus has loved you. That is the standard. Now, real quickly before we move on, can you imagine, and this is a bit of a pipe dream probably, unfortunately, but can you imagine how different people in our culture would view Christians if that's what we were known for? That's the last thing that we're known for in general. It's very unfortunate because it's what the first century followers of Jesus were known for. The distinguishing characteristic of a Jesus follower in the first century was, oh my gosh, look at how they love people. Imagine if that's what we were known for today. People might not agree with what we believe, but I'm telling you, they would want you working at their workplace. Because they would say, those people are the most dependable, responsible, trustworthy folks. They work harder than anybody else. I can give them the keys to this thing. I don't have to worry about them stealing or cheating or taking something. Nope. Those people are extraordinarily honest, and they're so dependable, and they're incredibly hardworking. I don't believe like they believe, but I wish I had more of them working for me. That would be the perspective people had. People would want to marry Christians, not because of what we believe, but because every time they look at Christians getting married, they realize it's like they're in a submission competition with one another. Look at them, like they're constantly competing to see who can out-submit the other one. No, you go first. No, I'm going to put you first. No, I'm going to put you first. You want to talk about marriage problems? Wouldn't that be incredible if your marriage problem was just which one of you outserved the other one? Eventually, you're like, please walk through the door first. Go ahead, you know? That's how Christian marriages looked in the first century. Imagine people would want their sons and their daughters to date Christians. Why? Because they would have no concern. Those people right there are going to respect and honor my son or my daughter as they date them more than anybody else in our culture. So they believe some weird stuff, but oh my gosh, I know how they're going to treat my son or my daughter. That's phenomenal. I mean, you can pick any part of culture. If we were just known by this and could practice this, it would change everything, just like it changed everything in the first century. And that's why in all of Paul's writings, even though they struggled at times with getting it right themselves, he would constantly come back to, hey, stop trying to follow the old covenant. You don't have to follow that anymore. You follow Jesus' brand new covenant command for you. You just love one another the way Jesus has loved you. And let me give you some examples how. This is where you take your application cues. So Jesus is honored. So, Paul made a significant contribution because he wrote about a fourth of the New Testament. He made a significant contribution because he, as much as anyone, was positioned to explain the relationship between the Old Covenant or the Old Testament and Jesus' new covenant command for us. And then he made one final contribution I want to talk about for a few minutes. And this may be the biggest one of all. Paul authenticates the most important event recorded in our New Testament documents. Paul authenticates that the resurrection actually happened. And the case that he can make for this is stronger than any other case we have. Now, at the risk of giving the most in the future teaser possible, I'm not going to talk about this a lot today because we're going to talk about this on Easter. That's 2 months down the road, but hang with me. Some of you may not be back until then, so you won't miss anything. On Easter, we're going to dive into this, but I want to give you 2 really quick reasons why this is such a big deal. The first one is Paul's life change himself. If you are somebody who's skeptical, did the resurrection really happen? How can they believe something so unbelievable? I get that. But one of the things you owe it to yourself to dive into is, apart from the resurrection, apart from Jesus actually coming back to life, how can you credibly explain how Paul did a 180 in an afternoon? How Paul went from, I am the greatest enemy of the church and I'm going to kill this movement, to being its greatest advocate. It is hard to find another credible explanation other than the explanation Paul himself gives us, which is, I saw and heard Jesus with my own eyes. That's one way he authenticates it. We'll talk about that another day. The other way he authenticates it is this. Paul wrote a letter, as I told you earlier, to the Corinthians. He actually wrote a couple we still have. But 1 Corinthians, the first letter he wrote 20 years or less after the resurrection. And in his letter, you can go read this for yourself. In Paul's letter to the Corinthians, he talks about the resurrection happening. He talks about how all followers of Jesus believe in the resurrection. Some people will argue, hey, Christians didn't start teaching and believing in the resurrection until everybody who could have seen it had died and they just made it up. No. 20 years after the resurrection, Paul's talking about how Christians believe in the resurrection and it's part of their worship. And then after he gives this creed about how Christians believe in the resurrection, he lists names of people who saw Jesus with their own eyes. After they watched him die, then they saw him alive. Paul does all this in a document that was written 20 years after the resurrection. So when people say, oh, it's a legend that developed, there is no way you can develop a legend in a 20-year period of time. It's impossible. I'll give you an example. Almost 20 years ago, not quite, but almost 20 years ago, we experienced 9/11. And over the last 20 years, there have been some crazy folks who have tried to spin it as it was a conspiracy theory and 9/11 didn't really happen and those towers didn't really come down. And all of us, when we see that, we look at those people and go, you're nuts. And the reason we think they're nuts is because most of us remember where we were and what happened when 9/11 took place. And if you're too young to have remembered that on that day, you know thousands of people who do remember and were there when 9/11 happened. So when people try to spin that, there's no way it gains any traction, is it? We all know better. We were there. We saw it ourselves. Well, you take that and you apply it to what Paul wrote to the Corinthians 20 years after the resurrection. The same principle applies. Paul's not vague. He names names. These people saw Jesus die and then they saw him come back to life. You're welcome to go talk to them. Most of the people, Paul tells us, not all, but most of the 500 people who saw Jesus die and rise again. 20 years later, Paul says in this letter, most of them are still alive. You can go have a conversation with any of them to see if it was true. There's no way that legend could have developed. It would have been too easy to shoot down. So if you didn't have anything else other than the letter Paul wrote to the Corinthians, you can make a compelling case for this is a historical fact. Based on the life change that Paul experienced and based on how early this letter was written after the resurrection. So these early followers of Jesus, Jewish and especially Gentile, they had the Jewish scriptures, they had the 4 accounts of Jesus' life, and then they had the correspondence that Paul had written, and there was some other correspondence that Peter had written. He wrote a couple of letters. There was correspondence that James, the brother of Jesus, had written, and Jude had written, and then John had also written some other letters, and there were a few others. So they have all of this. And you know what they did? They collected it and they protected it. They collected it and protected it and collected it and protected it. In some cases, over the centuries, at the cost of their own lives. Because they considered these writings to be so valuable and reliable, sacred, inspired scripture. These were the writings that were the authority for them in terms of how to live as a follower of Jesus and how to know what was true. They collected and protected them because they knew they came from eyewitnesses who were there, who saw it with their own eyes. And they valued their input and their accounts to that extent. And then you get to the 4th century. And Christians have given their lives to protect these throughout the years. And finally, you know the backstory on this. Finally, in the 4th century, in the 300s, Constantine becomes emperor of Rome, the Roman Empire. And he lifts the religious ban on Christianity. And for the first time, scholars are able to come out of the shadows and they're able to work together. And they begin to bring all the copies that they protected over the years that different people have. They begin to gather them up in one place. And they put them all in one book that by the end of the 4th century, by around 388, they finally call the Bible. And that's the story of how we got the Bible. Now, let me wrap up with this. What do I want you to know, and what do I want you to do as a result of this series? Well, first, let me tell you what I hope. If you don't get anything else out of this, here's what I hope you know. That Christianity was created by an event, the resurrection, that launched a movement, that produced documents that were collected and protected and eventually bound together in a book. In other words, I just want you to understand the Bible, as we know the Bible today, the Bible didn't create Christianity. The resurrection created Christianity. The Bible is not the foundation for our faith. The resurrection is the foundation of our faith. And all of these documents we have that are now part of our Bible, that's all chaptered and versed and mapped and wrapped, all of those documents are just detailing and accounting, and they were written to help us know who Jesus is and what he did for you and for me. That's it. That's it. So you know what I would love for you to do? I would love for you to ask yourself a question and then develop a simple habit. The question I would love for you to ask yourself is not, am I at peace with everything in the Bible? You may or may not be, but that's not the most relevant question. The central question you have to ask yourself is, am I at peace with the God who sent his Son to die and rise again for me and my sins? That's the question you have to ask. And you know where you discover Jesus, and you know where you discover how much he loves you? In these documents. So what I would love for you to do is, whether you believe it all or don't believe it all, just to make it a habit to read a little bit of it every day, to see what you can discover for yourself in there about who Jesus is and how he feels about you. Most every morning, not all, but most every morning since I was 12 years old, I have begun my day by opening up the Bible and reading a part of one of these documents. And nothing has shaped my life more. And I would love for you to develop that habit, because I'm telling you, nothing will shape your life more. There's nowhere you'll find more wisdom. There's nowhere you'll find more insight. And there's nowhere you'll find how to live a better life than when you open it up and you discover Jesus for yourself in these documents written by people who were there and saw it and heard it with their own eyes. Jesus died and was buried. He was raised and was seen. And all because of his love for you and me. That is the story of the Bible. Would you pray with me? Father, thank you so much for protecting and preserving these documents. It is just unbelievable. Whether you believe it or not, it's unbelievable that we can read the writings of Paul from 2,000 years ago, of Peter, of James, of John, and Matthew. Thank you for preserving these texts so we can discover for ourselves who Jesus is, how you feel about us, and what it looks like to live by this new covenant command, this simple idea. It's so simple and yet so demanding, to love one another the way Jesus has loved us. Father, my prayer today would simply be that no matter where people are in terms of their beliefs, that they would carve out just a little bit of time to dig into these texts every day, to read just a little bit, and discover for themselves what's there. And in the process, discover you in a more personal way. And it is in Jesus' name we ask all these things. Amen.